Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation on gender responsive budgeting with Marion Sharples from the Women's Budget Group in the UK. A quick bio of Marion. She's the head of international partnerships and training at the UK Women's Budget Group. She's a leading feminist economics which is a leading economics think tank in the UK. Marion runs the international training program on gender responsive budgeting, working with civil society organizations and policymakers in a range of countries. Previously, she ran the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. Marion's commitment to intersectional feminism is evident in her local as well as global activism. Marion also works teaching refugee women in her community how to cycle. She holds a Gender Development and Globalization degree from the London School of Economics and is a CLOR Fellow. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Marion to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you so much for joining. I've already started sharing my slides, which you should be able to see. But if you have any trouble, please do let us know by writing in the chat. Okay, brilliant. So I'm just going to crack straight on with my presentation. We don't have a huge amount of time and I want to cover as much as possible. So yeah, as Samantha said, my name is Marion Sharples. I'm the head of international partnerships and training at the UK Women's Budget Group. So I'm joining you all from London this afternoon for me, this morning for many of you. This is just an overview of what I would like to cover in the next half an hour that we have together. So I'll just say a few words about who we are, a little bit of context for you, and then I'll move straight into what is gender responsive budgeting, how we can use it, and just give an indication of some resources and next steps, which might be useful if you're interested in pursuing this further. And then we'll also have some time for questions at the end of the session. So to get things started, who is the UK Women's Budget Group? So we are a network based in the UK of over 1,000 academics, members of non-governmental organisations and unions, as well as the general public. And what we do, we scrutinise government economic policy from a gender perspective. We've been going for around 30 years, a little bit more than 30 years now. And really, the Women's Budget Group was set up when a few feminist economists got together to analyse the budget every year, and from a gender perspective, and it just grew from there, really. So now we don't do that once a year; we do that year round, of course. And as well as analysing the impacts of economic policy, we also put forward our own proposals for a gender equal future. So one of the biggest projects that we've done recently, which Samantha mentioned in her introduction, was the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which really laid out a blueprint and a roadmap of the caring economy that we want to create, really. So that was published last year. And another strand of the work that we do is around capacity building, so working with women and women's groups. We do that both at local level in the UK, and also my strand of work is the international training program that we run, where we work with civil society organisations in other countries and to support them on their gender responsive budgeting work, be that themselves or be that with regard to lobbying and working with policymakers. So that's a little bit of context about who we are, just to provide that before we get going onto the nitty-gritty of the session today, which is, of course, about gender responsive budgeting. So what is that? First of all, it can be useful to clarify what it's not. So it's not a special budget for women, as often sometimes misconstrued as that, and it's not a special focus on spending aimed at women either. What it is an analysis of how all areas of spending impact different groups of women and men in different ways. It's about understanding who can access services, public services, and it's about asking who pays for what. So a gender responsive budget is one that works for everybody. It's one that ensures gender equitable access to and distribution of resources. It analyses the effect of women and men and the gender roles associated with them. And it means transforming budgets to achieve gender equality commitments. So why do we need to do it? Why is it important? Well, we know that, of course, there are gender differences in roles, experiences, behaviours and relationships, and we know that those are structural. So, for example, we know that women are more likely than men to have responsibility for unpaid work, which can mean that they have less time for paid work and other activities. We know that women, on average, earn less than men. They accumulate lower levels of wealth and are more likely to be living in poverty. And of course, we know that income may not be shared equally within households. So taking those sorts of things into account, it's not surprising that policy impacts differently on different groups of women and men. But of course, most economic decisions are made by men based on their lives. Of course, it's also really important to point out that policy that doesn't take these sorts of differences into account, of course, it can fail outright, but it can also have unintended consequences if these differences aren't taken into account, aren't acknowledged, aren't thought about, and aren't built into policy. So just some kind of broad principles of gender impact analysis. It can always be good to take a lifetime perspective. So taking into account the fact that long-term effects may outweigh current impacts. So for example, if we look at policies that make it easier for women to do unpaid care, that can have negative impacts in the longer run, looking at women's lifetime earnings and pensions in older age, for example. It's also always good to reflect on the impact of policy on unpaid care. So, for example, recognising that the fiscal benefits of encouraging women into paid employment are not free. They have an impact on unpaid care. And it's crucial to take an intersectional approach to the analysis that we do, focusing on the least advantaged groups, so groups which experience multiple and intersecting forms of oppression and disadvantage. So when we're working with gender responsive budgeting, these are some key questions to be thinking about. We want to reflect on what is the current situation of different groups of women and men. What are their needs? What are their priorities? How is government money raised and what impact does this have? How is that money then spent? And what happens as a result of this spending? So that can include both the both analysis of the likely impact of policies on gender equality. So based on what we know already, based on similar experiences elsewhere, and simulations that have been done, for example. We can look at the impact on income, on wealth, employment, health outcomes, time use, and other indicators. And of course, we can also look at monitoring the actual impact of the policies on those different areas as well, once a policy has been implemented. So moving on to a little bit deeper here, how can we use gender responsive budgeting? What does it look like? And what I've done here is I've brought a tool that we use, kind of looking at the budget cycle in an image form, and this green circle that we can see here. If we start at the top, income projections, this is obviously where things begin. Looking at where government will look at the income that it has at its disposal, and then it will start to think about allocating that based on its spending priorities. So looking at, based on its manifesto, for example, pledges that it's made, commitments that it's already made, what is this government going to be spending its money on? And then, of course, there's the agreement of the budget, and this budget cycle is general enough so that it is translatable into most contexts, but obviously procedures are different, vary from country to country, and of course also looking at different levels of government. So it might be the cabinet would agree the budget, then it goes to Parliament where it's debated and perhaps amended, and then it's finally agreed. And then, of course, the funds are released to the departments themselves where they're then enacted. And then both spending and the ways of using revenue, ways of raising revenue are audited before the outcomes are monitored, and then we begin again back at the beginning of the next budget cycle. So looking at this, then this is the different stages of the budget cycle. And what I'm showing here on the next slide is what governments can do in terms of gender responsive budgeting actions throughout that cycle. So if we begin again at the top of the circle, what governments can do with regard to gender responsive budgeting is addressing some of the gender impacts of revenue raising policies. So, for example, what forms of taxation are used? What are the gender implications of that taxation? What about borrowing? What are the gender implications there? Then moving on to the next stage, governments have the opportunity to carry out gender impact assessments by department. So, for example, looking at the Department for Health, what is the Department for Health planning to do, and what are the likely impacts of that spending proposals. Then, of course, there's the option for governments to do cumulative impact assessments. So, looking at the kind of joint picture of all of those different spending plans per department. What are the cumulative impacts likely to be on different groups of women and men? Then, of course, there's the committee review phase, which is also another space for amendment and bringing in that gendered analysis. Then we move around to making sure that the funds pledged, the funds provided match the funds pledged in the first place. Looking at gender indicators, how are we going to measure, how are we going to review the policies that have been implemented, and then evaluating and feeding back, and then we go back to the top. So these are some examples of different stages throughout that budget cycle where governments can intervene, looking at gender responsive budgeting. And then the last piece of this circle here, I know in the middle it's a little bit small now, is this large orange ring around the edge. And this is depicting civil society actions. What can civil society do to promote gender responsive budgeting at different stages of the budget? So starting at the top once more, we've got that analysis of gender impact of revenue raising policies. So what research has civil society done, for example, to demonstrate the different impacts of taxation, different types of taxation on different groups of women and men, which then can be used by governments to address that and so on. And then we have analysing needs, lobbying for spending to meet needs, lobbying for impact assessments, conducting them themselves. That happens a lot. Often often governments don't do those gender impact assessments, which they have capacity to do, or if they do, they can be quite sparse. And so often civil society actually does those impact assessments themselves, and that can be at the policy level, at the departmental level, or it can also be at the cumulative level, looking across a range of policies and often highlighting governmental gaps. And then at the committee review stage, of course, this is a really great option, a really great space for civil society to contribute and to promote the research that they've done, the findings that they've got, and also inform the bill amendments that are proposed by policymakers. Then, of course, there's an accountability piece, so ensuring that the spending on key projects matches the allocations given, drawing up gender indicators, again, which can then inform how governments measure the impact, monitor the spending, making sure that it's getting out to the places that it should be and that it's being spent on the policies and the projects that it should be. And then, of course, the evaluation stage, looking at that impact, what has it been, how have different groups of women and men experienced this, and what do they need going forward, what needs to be changed. And then we're back at the beginning of the budget cycle again, and it all begins again. So this is really a kind of quite a bit of an overview, I suppose. I understand it's a little bit abstract, but I wanted to kind of build up the budget cycle for you and to demonstrate how there's a role for both governments and also civil society at each stage of the budget cycle. But what I want to move on to now is having some more concrete examples of what this looks like in practice. So we've looked at the different stages of the budget cycle where interventions can be made, but what are some examples of that? So, for example, what we have here in the this is a case study from Sweden. So in the Swedish city of Kalmar, planners discovered that fewer women were taking the bus at night because of concerns about walking home from the bus stops. So in response, the local municipality introduced a policy where night stops were introduced, which meant that passengers could request to get off the bus in between sanctioned stops, and also only one person could get off the bus at one time. And so as a result of this policy, the number of people using the service at night increased. So this is an example of how gender analysis informs policy change at the governmental level. This is local government level. And another example I'll share here is the role of civil society. So this is the example I'm using is some research that we did at the Women's Budget Group a few years ago, looking at the employment effects of investment in care. And so this was an international comparative study which we did for the International Trade Union Confederation a few years ago, as I say. And what it did was it compared the employment effects of investing 2% of GDP in the care industry and compared that to investing 2% of GDP in the construction industry. So what was the impact on employment? And employment was including direct, indirect, and induced employment. So, and this study took place in 7 OECD countries, including the US. And I'll just share the results here on the next slide. So if we look at the graph, we can see that the 7 countries are listed across the bottom. And for each country, you can see there's 2 bars. One is investment in construction and one is investment in care. And each of the bars are broken up into yellow and blue. And the yellow is men, so men's jobs. And the blue parts are women's jobs, jobs for women. And along the y-axis, along the side, we can see the percentage point increase in the employment rate for investment in construction and in care in these 7 countries. So what do we see? What does the graph tell us? If we're looking at total employment effects, we can see that the effects of investing in care are at least 50% higher than investing in construction across all countries except Japan. Japan was slightly lower, but it was still an increase. So looking at the graph, we can see that the bars on the right of each country, so the ones labelled care, are 50% higher than the bars on the left labelled construction. So what do we see? This means that investing in care creates more jobs overall than investing in construction, which is interesting. Looking a bit deeper, if we look at the gender employment gap, we can see that the women's employment rate depicted in the graph as the blue sections of the bars is significantly larger for care than it is for construction. So not only does investing in care create more jobs overall, it also reduces the gender employment gap, while investing in construction increases it. And finally, what we can see is that men's employment rises by almost as much from an investment of 2% of GDP in care as in construction, which may be an unexpected result. So this is an example of research that we've done to demonstrate the impact of investment in care. And we've used this at various stages of the budget cycle in the UK context. So that might be in the early stages when we're lobbying for spending priorities, or a little bit later on when we're working with committees, for example, publishing briefings, using those to inform the committees, and giving evidence, to example, for those committees, and then working with policymakers to make amendments to policies, and saying, well, look, we've got this research which shows the employment effects of investing in care, for example, and using that at different stages of the budget cycle. So a couple of gender responsive budgeting in practice. What I'd just like to do next is invite you just to take a moment and reflecting on your own work, the own space, the space that you work within, and just take a moment to think about any of the questions on the slide. So where can you use gender responsive budgeting? What would you need to use it? And how would a gender impact analysis of the budget support your work? So I'll just leave you for a moment just to have a think about that. If you want to share any thoughts you have in the chat, please feel free, but there's no obligation. So I'll just leave you for a minute here just to think about the answers to these questions in your context.
Hi, Marion. Had a question come in actually about in your work with the Women's Budget Group, which project has had the deepest impact on your worldview?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll come to questions at the end. Is that okay? If we just I'll just save that question for the end.
Okay, great.
Brilliant. I'll save that question for the end. But yeah, okay. I will just invite you to come back into the space now. And the last thing I want to do before we open for questions is share some places where you might want to go next to deepen your knowledge and understanding of gender responsive budgeting. So the first thing I wanted to flag, which I think is a really great resource, the Government of Canada has an online course on gender-based analysis plus, it calls it, and it just takes a few hours, and it's online. You can do it yourself. It's free, and it's a really useful tool, I think, particularly for policymakers and officials to look at some examples of gender-responsive budgeting in action. So I would, that's something that might be of use, maybe of interest. And then I also wanted to mention, so as I mentioned earlier, the programme that I run at the UK Women's Budget Group is our Global Partnerships and Learning Programme, where we work with civil society organisations in a range of countries on gender responsive budgeting efforts. So if that's something that might be of interest to you or your group, please feel free to check out their website. I've popped it there. It's just very simple. wbg.org.uk/GPL. That's for Global Partnerships and Learning Programme. And another resource which might be quite useful is our casebook called Women Count, which is more targeted at civil society organisations who are interested in gender responsive budgeting. So yeah, I just thought I'd pop the link into that there. And then the final one I wanted to reference was the report that I mentioned earlier in my presentation around investing in the care economy. and looking at the impacts of investment in care compared to construction. So I just wanted to share those resources in the hope that they are useful to you. And if there's any links that you would like me to paste into the chat as well, please just let me know. And yeah, that's it. Those are my details there, in case anyone would like to follow up with any further conversations. But apart from that, it's been brilliant to share this time with you, and I would love to open to any questions that you might have. I had this one question already about the project that we've done, which has had the biggest impact on my worldview, which is a great question. But I'll just take a moment, Samantha, maybe if there are any other questions coming through, and I can answer them all at the same time.
Excuse me. There's another one about what are the arguments, if there are any, that you hear against gender responsive budgeting that you've heard in your work at the Women's Budget Group, and how can we respond to those arguments productively?
That's great.
Or, and the last question, if we have enough time, are what areas of government budgeting most overlook the gendered perspective or cause the most potential harm when they aren't formatted using a gender responsive lens?
Brilliant. Just making a note of those. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for these excellent questions. So the first question, which project has had the biggest impact on my worldview? That is a really great question. I think I would say a project that we did a few years ago at the Women's Budget Group before I joined, called Intersecting Inequalities. And this report basically looked at, it did a cumulative impact assessment, which I discussed earlier in the slides, and what it did was look at the impact of austerity measures on different groups of women and men, which had been implemented in the UK since 2010. And it took into account both the impact of cuts to public services and tax changes, which had happened as well. And it had this cumulative impact assessment done, and what it showed was some really, really striking differences about how far from the government rhetoric around kind of everybody tightening their belts and everybody having to kind of buckle down and rein in spending and that kind of thing. It was actually, we found that austerity was really, really disproportionately shouldered, particularly by women of colour in the UK, disabled women and single mothers. Those were the groups that were most impacted. And I think that was just an incredibly powerful resource to have to show that the impact of austerity policies that the government had been pursuing was absolutely not neutral in any way or shape or form, was not shared fairly at all. So I'd say that was a really powerful piece of work that I continue to think about and continue to refer to a lot in my day-to-day work now. Arguments against gender responsive budgeting. That's a really good question. And what about some kind of effective responses? Often what we are faced with is people saying that we don't have the data. There's just not the data available to kind of measure the impact. So we just don't know. We haven't got the data, so there won't be a gender impact. So we're just going to carry on and do it anyway. And what we always encourage groups to do or to say is to work with the data that you do have. So that can even be, it can be qualitative data, it can be interviews, it can be looking at what you do have, even if it was a bit of time ago. You might be able to collect data at the local level, and you might be able to use data from other countries or other cities, other municipalities in similar positions, and think about why that might be similar situations based on what you have. So it's often, of course, there can always be better data. We know that, but we also know, of course, that we've got to go with what we've got as well. We've got to use what we have right now, and things can always be made better, but that's not an excuse to just not do things now and to not think about the impacts that these policies are having. So we just encourage civil society organizations to use the data that they do have available, see what they can collect. Also, it can be really useful to work with academics. We find that a lot, that academics can often share data, information. They always want to use that to show the impact of their work. So we always encourage a kind of cross collaboration as well. But I would encourage you to look at our Women Count casebook, the one I mentioned to, and I can pop that in the chat because that gives some really useful tips about how to deal with difficult situations and arguments.
Great, and we'll be sure to pop that in our resource library afterwards. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a great presentation, and we really appreciate it.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me.